Good evening. It's January 9th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome all of you to our weekly broadcast here at LaRouchepack.com for our Friday night webcast. This is at the end of a truly historic week, and I think this will be a very important show that you're watching here tonight. I'm joined in the studio by Megan Beats from the LaRouche Pack basement team, as well as Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review. Now, I'm going to begin tonight's broadcast by reading our institutional question for the week, but I'll directly follow this with something before I invite Mr. Steinberg to the podium to address this question. The question reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, how do we deter, counter, and deal with the type of radical Islamist Salafist terrorism that we have seen in Paris this week, and previously in such incidents as the Mumbai attacks of late 2008 and, of course, the 9/11 attacks? In some instances, these attacks are blind terrorist attacks targeting innocent people and aimed at tearing down the fabrics of democratic societies and cultures. Thank you. Now, before I invite Jeffrey Steinberg to come to the podium to deliver what Mr. LaRouche's answer is to this question, I'm going to show a short clip from what was a truly historic press conference that occurred this past Wednesday on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., with which both Jeff and I had the opportunity to attend. This press conference, which bears directly on the answer to the question, which you just heard, was hosted by Representatives Walter Jones from North Carolina and Stephen Lynch from Massachusetts, who are two of the primary sponsors of H-Res 14, the newly reintroduced resolution demanding the release of the classified 28 pages of the Congressional Joint Inquiry Report on 9/11. This press conference featured the former co-chair of that Congressional Joint Inquiry, Senator Bob Graham from Florida, as well as featuring Terry Strada, who's the national co-chair of the 9/11 Families United for Justice Against Terrorism, and other representatives of the 9/11 families. This press conference occurred literally hours after the initial attacks on the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo in Paris, which I think placed the proceedings of the press conference in their proper scope of sobriety and extreme urgency. As you'll hear from Senator Graham in his remarks, these attacks really must be seen as the direct consequence of the cover-up by both the Bush and the Obama administrations of the truth about who financed and who organized the attacks on 9/11, making the issue of declassifying these 28 pages not merely a question of setting the historical record straight, but one which has direct bearing on the present peace and security of the world. As Senator Graham says, it is as current as the headlines which we will read today. So I'd like to play this video for you now, after which I'll ask Jeffrey Steinberg to come to the podium. First, you'll see Representative Walter Jones give a short introduction, followed by some key excerpts from Senator Graham's speech.
Senator Bob Graham spent 18 years in the Senate. He's a man that has the nation's respect for the type of person that he is. He and Senator Shelby released the Joint Inquiry Report into 9/11 in December of 2002. Again, the report goes to the White House for final review. The White House at that time, under George Bush, decided that the 28 pages should be classified. The families have suffered long enough. The American people have been denied the truth long enough. It is time for the truth to come out. It is time for the truth to come out. As Stephen said, I want to thank Senator Bob Graham. He had a daughter who was sworn in to the United States House of Representatives yesterday, and congratulations on that, Senator. With that, a man who has driven this issue since 2002, I'm not even going to begin to tell you what he has done, from court action to other types of action, because he knows that the truth will set America free. So with that, I introduce the esteemed Senator from Florida, Bob Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I too want to thank Walter and Steve, Congressman Jones and Lynch, for their leadership in bringing this matter to the attention of the Congress. I want to thank the family members who have been, without question, the most influential force in all of the changes that have occurred as a result of 9/11, and will be the most significant force in terms of convincing the President that it is time to give the American people the truth. Needless to say, my remarks that I will spouse this morning are considerably different than they would have been but for events in Paris this morning, which in my judgment bring this matter into its proper focus. What have been the consequences of this refusal to release the pages? The consequences, in my judgment, are three. One is a denial of the truth. A core question in 9/11 is, did these 19 people act alone, or did they have a network of support which facilitated their ability to carry out a very complex plot? No one who has looked closely at the facts, including the individuals that I just named, have come to a conclusion other than that it is highly improbable that the 19 people could have acted alone. Yet the official position of the United States government has been that they did act alone, and that there is no necessity for further inquiry into the question of whether there was a support network. We're now in the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War, and we've had a national history classroom over the past few years as incidents that were consistent with a date in the current era coincided with a date during that war. One of the pieces of information that we have learned, at least I have learned, is that President Lincoln had a policy throughout the war that every message that came into the government, specifically into the State Department, was a matter of public record on a daily basis. His feeling was that if the support of the American people were going to be maintained in a war which was increasingly bloody, many loss of lives and loss of treasure, that it took the confidence of the American people that their government was conducting itself in an appropriate manner, and that the key to that confidence was disclosure. I wish we applied the Lincoln-esque standard to what happened in 9/11. The second issue is the issue of justice. Some 3,000 members of the families who were lost on 9/11 have been trying for years to get justice through our system for the losses that they have suffered. The position of the United States government has been to protect Saudi Arabia. At virtually every step of the judicial process, when the United States government was called upon to take a position, it has been a position adverse to the interests of the United States citizens seeking justice and protective of the government which, in my judgment, was the most responsible for that network of support. Again, an example from the Civil War. The British had signed a neutrality agreement with the United States that they would not be involved in the Civil War. It was found out subsequently that, in fact, their shipyards had been building military vessels for the Confederacy. After the war ended, the United States didn't forget. It did not walk away from the negative effects of Britain's perfidy. Rather, it pursued it and finally secured a recognition of what the British had done and some compensation for the consequences of their action. What a difference between the way this country saw itself as a proudful defender of justice for its citizens and what we are experiencing today. The third consequence is the issue of national security. And frequently those who have defended non-disclosure have said this cannot be made available to the American people because it will be adverse to our national security. It will affect methods and sources of information or other information that is inappropriate to be made publicly known. As the two congressmen have just said, they both read the report, not 12 years ago as I participated in writing the report, but they have read it recently and have both come to the same conclusion that we did a dozen years ago, that there is no threat to national security in disclosure. I'm going to make the case today that there's a threat to national security by non-disclosure, and we saw another chapter of that today in Paris. Here are some facts. The Saudis know what they did. They are not persons who are unaware of the consequences of their government's actions. Second, the Saudis know that we know what they did. Somebody in the federal government has read these 28 pages. Someone in the federal government has read all the other documents that have been covered up so far. And the Saudis know that. What would you think the Saudis' position would be if they knew what they had done, they knew what the United States knew what they had done, and they also observed that the United States had taken a position of either passivity or actual hostility to letting those facts be known? What would the Saudi government do in that circumstance, which is precisely where they have been for more than a decade? Well, one, they have continued, maybe accelerated, their support for one of the most extreme forms of Islam, Wahhabism, throughout the world, particularly in the Middle East. And second, they have supported their religious fervor with financial and other forms of support of the institutions which were going to carry out those extreme forms of Islam. Those institutions have included mosques, madrasas, and military. Al-Qaeda was a creature of Saudi Arabia. The regional groups, such as Al-Shabaab, have been largely creatures of Saudi Arabia. And now ISIS is the latest creature. Yes, I hope and I trust that the United States will crush ISIS. But if we think that is the definition of victory, we are being very naive. ISIS is a consequence, not a cause. It is a consequence of the spread of extremism, largely by Saudi Arabia. And if it is crushed, there will be another institution established, financed, supported to carry on the cause. So the consequences of our passivity to Saudi Arabia have been that we have tolerated this succession of institutions, violent, extreme, extremely hurtful to the region of the Middle East, and a threat to the world, as we saw this morning in Paris. So I conclude by saying this is a very important issue. It may seem stale to some, but it is as current as the headlines that we will read today. It is an issue that goes to the core of the United States contract with its people, that the people would give the government the credibility and support to govern. The government will give the people the information upon which they can make good judgments as to the appropriateness of governmental action. It's as fundamental as justice to our people who have suffered by this evil union of extremism and a very powerful nation state. And it is the security of the people of the United States of America. So I again thank the congressmen for their leadership. I hope that they will soon be joined by a rising tide of other members of Congress who recognize the importance of this issue. And then finally, that the President of the United States will declare that he is going to adopt the Lincoln-esque standard of full disclosure and rely on the intelligence and judgment and patriotism of the American people to decide what the appropriate course of action should be. Thank you.
Now, the full press conference is available on LaRouchePAC.com. This was live streamed exclusively by the LaRouche PAC website, and I encourage you to watch it in full if you haven't already done so. And it is your job to circulate this broadcast as widely as possible to help to continue to build the overwhelming momentum on this issue, which has now already begun to accelerate quite rapidly over the last 48 hours with widespread coverage in the media, both nationally and internationally. Although this was the third such press conference that Congressman Jones and Lynch have done on this issue, this was the first time that Senator Graham was personally involved. And I think that the combination of the timing of events with Senator Graham's physical presence on Capitol Hill this week and the leadership role that he is now playing is of crucial importance in securing the crucial next step in this campaign, which is to get a Senate sponsor to introduce a companion resolution to H.Res. 14, the Jones-Lynch Massey bill. And the courage and the depth of Senator Graham's role in this fight, which was clearly reflected in the speech that you just saw, has already begun to have a radiating effect of optimism across the country and especially internationally, as people see that there is a viable source of leadership in the United States among people who are truly patriotic and have a depth of understanding of the principles and the history of our republic and have the courage to defend it. Senator Graham's emphasis on what he called the Lincoln-esque standard of presidential leadership, the trust that's required between an informed and intelligent citizenry and their government, along with the direct parallel that he drew between the events of 9/11 and what he called the British perfidy in arming and supporting the Confederacy, I think is profoundly relevant to our discussion here today. So, to introduce somebody who has worked directly with Mr. LaRouche on the true story behind 9/11 and has personally been on the ground, behind the scenes, you could say, on this for over a decade, in the center of the fight to reveal the truth about what is contained in the 28 pages and elsewhere, I'm happy to introduce to you Jeffrey Steinberg. So, Jeff, why don't you come up to the podium?
Thanks, Matt. I think that Senator Graham really set the framework for answering the institutional question, which focused on this past several days' events in France. But I think the point should be clear to all of you by now that it's impossible to even begin to discuss those events without minimally going back to the 9/11 events and the brutal cover-up that has followed. In other parts of the press conference on Wednesday, Senator Graham and I believe also Congressman Lynch made the point that when government documents are subject to classification review before being released to the public, very often there are redactions. There are names omitted. Perhaps sometimes the names of countries are omitted because there's genuine concerns about what they might reveal. Never has there been a document of the importance of the joint congressional inquiry where an entire chapter, virtually with every word in the chapter, locked down and declared to be classified. And every member of Congress who has recently read those 28 pages, which was a fight in and of itself, have said that there's nothing that rises to the standard of legitimate national security concerns. What they do reveal, and there are important elements of those 28 pages that we do know about. They reveal, number one, that there was, in fact, an extensive support network that was operating in the case of at least the lead two hijackers, that's to say, the first two 9/11 hijackers who arrived in the United States well over a year prior to the September 11th attacks. They were met at the Los Angeles airport by two men identified as agents of the Saudi Arabian intelligence services. Those two Saudi agents arranged their housing, arranged other kinds of logistical requirements, provided them with money, and actually set them up in the initial flight training. Now, during this entire time, those two Saudi intelligence officers were regularly receiving money to finance those activities. Some of the money came through a company that was an exclusive private so-called front for the Saudi Ministry of Defense and Aviation. And one of those two Saudi intelligence officers was a ghost employee who received significant not only salary but expense account funds during the period that the 9/11 hijackers were being shepherded around and protected and financed. At least $50,000, probably closer to $70,000, came directly to those Saudi intelligence agents in the run-up to the 9/11 attacks from the personal bank account of the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Prince Bandar bin Sultan was a fixture in the United States for decades. Many people referred to him as Bandar Bush because he had such an extraordinary close relationship to both President Bush 41 and President Bush 43. Bandar's wife, Princess Haifa, was the sister of Prince Turki bin Faisal, who was the head of Saudi intelligence for over a decade and who resigned from that position 2 weeks before the 9/11 attacks. Prince Turki was one of the critical players who negotiated directly with Osama bin Laden and opened up the floodgates for Saudi funding to go into al-Qaeda during the period just prior to the African embassy bombings, the USS Cole attack, and then the 9/11 attacks. Now, I think that Senator Graham was very conscious of the juxtaposition of his comments about Saudi Arabia, the monarchy of Saudi Arabia, and his references to the perfidy of the British monarchy during the period of the Civil War. Because in point of fact, today it's almost impossible to distinguish between the British monarchy and the Saudi monarchy. They represent a singular force, and were it not for the active and witting involvement of the British monarchy and British intelligence services, the Saudis would not be in a position to have played the kind of role that they played in delivering critical support to the 9/11 hijackers and many, many other similar kinds of activities. There is, in fact, a well-documented picture of the convergence of British and Saudi monarchical operations that have direct bearing on 9/11. Beginning in 1985, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, although the ambassador here in Washington, D.C., was the personal broker with then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of a very unique barter agreement between the British and the Saudis, in which the British, through the BAE Systems major arms company, provided about $40 billion in various kinds of weapons, from fighter planes to radar systems, to the Saudi Ministry of Defense. The Saudis, in return, paid for all of that military hardware and some very hefty bribes that went to leading officials of the Saudi Defense Ministry and spread around among a number of other Saudi princes, by delivering 600,000 barrels of oil a day from 1985, and in fact, that program still continues to this day. Now, we did a little bit of work at EIR in crunching the numbers, and then we were supplied with certain critical confirming information from Prince Bandar himself. If you look at the amount of money that was spent by the British in providing those weapon systems, and then compare it to the amount of revenue that was generated by the spot market sales of literally one supertanker of oil a day for a period beginning in 1985 and running through to the present, you'll find that after all of those factors were taken into account, there was well over $100 billion in funds left over. Now, in a recent sanctioned biography, Prince Bandar boasted about the fact that the special relationship between the Saudi monarchy and the British monarchy allowed for a series of offshore funds to be established, black funds, probably the biggest pool of covert operations money ever assembled at one time. And these jointly British-Saudi administered funds, as Bandar himself boasted, went to quote-unquote the war against communism, by which he meant the financing of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which was one of the breeding grounds for Al-Qaeda and all of the other groups that we now see acting on the world stage. And so during the period that Bandar and his wife were providing funds to the Saudi intelligence officers who were shepherding around two of the key 9/11 hijackers, Bandar was regularly receiving bank transfers from the Bank of England, which was in the form of his quote-unquote broker's fee for the oil for weapons agreements between the British and the Saudis. It was called Al-Yamama. They called it the Dove, translated into English from Arabic. So Bandar's piece of that arrangement was at minimum $2 billion in broker's fees that were coming into his bank accounts at Riggs National Bank. Those were the funds that were being shipped off to help finance the 9/11 hijackers. This is all a piece of what's in those 28 pages. We don't know it because we snuck into the vault in the Capitol building and got to read them. We know it because there have been other accounts. For example, Senator Graham wrote a book in 2004 called Intelligence Matters, and that book recounted his experience as the chairman of the Joint House-Senate 9/11 Commission investigative panel. And so he recounted anecdotally a number of the key findings that were then included in the 28 pages that were blacked out by President Bush and Vice President Cheney, and which continue to be kept under wraps by President Obama, despite the fact that he promised the family members, the 9/11 families, on at least 2 face-to-face occasions, that he would make sure that those pages were declassified. Now, There are many other factors, I am sure, that are included in those 28 pages, which dealt with the question of whether or not there were support networks involved in backing up the terrorists and where the finances came for the 9/11 operations. The name Saudi Arabia, names of specific senior figures within the Saudi monarchy and in the Saudi government are all over those 28 pages. I had an opportunity during the press conference on Wednesday to ask Senator Graham to give a brief account of another element of the 9/11 story. Coming out of the investigation into the San Diego, California cell, where the Saudi intelligence officers were directly facilitating the activities and preparations of the hijackers, Senator Graham raised the question whether or not there were similar support operations in place in other critical locations where the hijackers were doing the preparatory work. That included places like Sarasota, Florida, where Mohammed Atta and one of the teams were training and were operating. It included Herndon, Virginia. It included Paterson, New Jersey. There were other places, but those 4 locations, San Diego, Sarasota, Herndon, and Paterson, were critical centers for the entire preparations and staging of the 9/11 operations. Senator Graham was from Florida. He asked the FBI at the point that he was chairing the Joint Congressional Inquiry for all files related to investigations that were conducted in Florida, whether there was any indication of a similar support apparatus operating in that area. The FBI came back repeatedly and said, no, there were no records, there was no such evidence. Many years later, basically in the last 2 years, through some work by investigative journalists and through the filing of a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, it was belatedly discovered that, yes, indeed, there was another support cell, this time led by a very prominent Saudi businessman who was in the employ of the Saudi royal family, whose home was frequently visited by Mohammed Atta and the other hijackers. And lo and behold, the FBI finally admitted that they had over 80,000 pages of documentation. That documentation was withheld from the Joint Congressional Inquiry, was suppressed and covered up for a dozen years, and now for the first time a federal judge is reviewing that material. This now puts a much bigger spotlight on not only the Saudi, but the Anglo-Saudi element within the entire 9/11 process. Now, again, had that information come out publicly, Congressman Jones, Congressman Lynch, Congressman Thomas Massey, who's the third co-sponsor of the bill to declassify the 28 pages, have all said that having read those 28 pages, and they've been very careful not to say a word about what they know of the content of those 28 pages, but they're free to give their opinions. And in all cases, they said that their entire view of the history of the last 15 years and more was fundamentally changed and shaken by what they read in those 28 pages. Now, here we are in the beginning of 2015. We've just seen this horrific attack that took place in Paris, France, on Wednesday morning of this week. The United States is now supposedly in an alliance with Saudi Arabia, with Great Britain, and with other countries from the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Persian Gulf, Sunni countries, mostly monarchies, supposedly waging war against the Islamic State, ISIS. Yet, the evidence contained in those 28 pages suggests that this Anglo-Saudi apparatus is the wellspring of all of the international terrorism that we've been facing over the last dozen years. Instead of revealing the profound and deep Saudi involvement in 9/11. All of the Saudis that were in the United States, including members of the bin Laden family, were the first people allowed on commercial airliners after the 9/11 attacks. Days after the 9/11 attacks, every single one of the people were rounded up and not put in jail, not rendered, but were put on a commercial flight and brought back to Saudi Arabia, safe out of the reach of U.S. law enforcement. So the cover-up has been persistent, and as the result of that, as Senator Graham just said at the press conference, there was a clear message: you can continue with impunity because the United States will cover up for this British-Saudi factor. Now, the events several days ago in Paris are still very much under investigation. It would be premature to wrap a ribbon around the story and claim that there's a clear picture of what was behind that operation. But certain things have already come out that are verified and clear. First of all, the two brothers who were involved as the attackers at the Charlie Hebdo office, who killed a dozen people, were part of a network, a recruiting network, a jihadist network that has been operating under the protective umbrella of the British monarchy for a very long time. There are mosques in London, including the Finsbury Park Mosque, where the recruiters of those two brothers were based and were for decades protected by the British Crown and by British intelligence. One of the leaders of that mosque, Abu Hamza, was recently, in the last several years, extradited to the United States and was put on trial for his role in certain terrorist activities and terrorist recruitment. And his principal defense in court in the United States is that while he was there as a recruiter for Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, he was also secretly working for British MI5, the equivalent of their FBI. And there's some reason to believe that there's a significant credibility to those claims. One way or the other, what you're dealing with here is, from the top down, an Anglo-Saudi apparatus that is the wellspring for the financing, for the training, and for the protection of international terrorism. And so long as that truth remains concealed from the American people and from the world as a whole, there is no way to stop this terrorism. This terrorism will go on uninterrupted, and yet by simply exposing the truth, starting with the release of those 28 pages, we can begin to solve this problem in the proper manner. Now, I should just add one footnote, because months before the 9/11 attacks, Executive Intelligence Review presented a dossier to then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And the dossier basically called for the State Department to consider whether the government of Great Britain should be put on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. That dossier, which can be found on the homepage of the EIR website, was based exclusively on government documentation, formal diplomatic démarches that were filed with the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office from governments as diverse as that of Egypt, Russia, Peru, Colombia, India, and in every instance, the complaint was the same, that terrorist networks that were active in all of those countries were being given safe haven protection, logistical support, and financing by the British government. In the case of Russia, there were mosques throughout the United Kingdom that were hotbeds of recruitment to send wild-eyed jihadist recruits, first to be trained in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then sent into the Caucasus to join with the Chechen networks that were carrying out a bloody terror campaign against Russia. In the case of Egypt, the Islamic Jihad group that carried out the massacre of tourists at the Luxor historic sites in Upper Egypt was run out of London by networks that were financed and protected by the British government. So the issue on the table with those 28 pages goes beyond just Saudi Arabia. It goes to the heart of the nature of the still existing imperial powers on this planet. And so by releasing those 28 pages and by unleashing an element of the truth, we not only have a unique opportunity to achieve justice for the families, for all Americans, and for all victims of terrorism worldwide, but we lay the basis for shutting this apparatus down once and for all, because terrorism is not a sociological phenomenon. It's not something that is managed from the bottom up. Like the international drug trade, it is run from the top down, and all roads ultimately lead back to what even the British press refer to as Londonistan.
So I'd like to briefly follow up more directly on the attacks in Paris in the context of the larger picture that you've just laid out, Jeff. Jacques Cheminade, a leading collaborator of Mr. LaRouche in France, who ran a very high-profile campaign for president during the recent presidential election in France, and who chairs the Solidarité et Progrès party, issued a statement yesterday in the wake of the initial attacks in Paris. Mr. Cheminade's position within France as a person of presidential standing and national significance makes what he says here extremely relevant for policymakers and others internationally. So I'd like to read an excerpt from his statement, which is titled, "Facing Our 9/11. France is threatened, but we must not give in to the dictatorship of fear. To keep a cool head, the nation must be united around the need to fight terrorism wherever it rears its head, and most importantly, to no longer tolerate the environment in which it flourishes. The fight against terrorism is the responsibility of our police force, our national gendarmerie, and our intelligence services. They must take very seriously the immediate threat before us everywhere and on a daily basis in their deployments. There are no lone wolves. There are small and medium-sized terrorist outfits that are more or less manipulated. Changing the overall environment is the responsibility of our public policy. We must hold to account Saudi Arabia and Qatar, where certain institutions and families have funded and continue to fund Salafist terrorism. We must demand an investigation into the role of the banking networks, especially the British ones, which act as transmission belts for the money used by Al-Qaeda and Islamic State terrorists. These are the counterfeiters who keep these misdirected criminals going. Moreover, we must not allow the debate to be detoured into being against immigration and Muslims, which would lead us to fall into the trap that has been set for us. In particular, fighting anti-Semitism with all our might means we are supporting the dialogue of civilizations, of cultures, and of religions. Only in a world without the City of London and Wall Street, and enlivened by the spirit of the New Silk Road on a world scale, the spirit of mutual development, can terrorism truly be fought. France can and must be a pillar of that new world. So I think what Mr. Cheminade concludes with here gets directly to the point. Lyndon LaRouche has been very clear in placing the events we saw this past week within the context of the ongoing political and financial crisis which is sweeping Europe and the United States, and the desperation which this has caused among those on Wall Street and in the City of London, which has prompted them to shift their drive for fascism and depopulation into high gear. At the same time, the Wall Street-owned Republican Party in the United States is using its new majority to attempt to slash social programs and ram through new bailouts for Wall Street, while Jeb Bush, the grandson of Hitler's financier Prescott Bush, is launching his campaign for president. In Europe, Victoria Nuland's puppet Prime Minister Yatz delivered an open apology for Hitler in Germany earlier this week, making a speech in which he actually stated the following, quote, "All of us still clearly remember the Soviet invasion of Ukraine and Germany. We need to avoid that it happens again." Mr. LaRouche commented that he should be called Yahtzee the Nazi. So, Jeff, I'd ask if you could please paint for us the broader context within which the events that we've seen occur this week must be understood in terms of the financial and political breakdown ongoing.
Thanks, Megan. Before going into the heart of your question, I just want to make a point about the Wall Street element of this picture that we've been discussing so far. Probably about a year and a half ago, the Senate Permanent Investigations Subcommittee produced a 300-page report which traced out the role of one bank, a British Commonwealth bank, in laundering drug money into the United States and in financing international terrorism in partnership with corresponding banks in Saudi Arabia. That report centered on a bank called HSBC, which was established during the middle of the 19th century, during the period of the British Opium Wars against China, and was for many decades known as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. The bank was a centerpiece of the entire evolution of the global drug trade and was openly the clearinghouse bank for international drug trafficking for many, many decades. The Senate report was comprehensive. It was extremely well documented. And when that report was presented to the Department of Justice, the Department of Justice refused to launch criminal prosecutions. This has been the standing policy of at least the last two presidencies, the Bush-Cheney presidency and now the Obama presidency, that Wall Street is so fragile, the City of London is so fragile, that were there to even be a single criminal prosecution of a Jamie Dimon or another leading Wall Street banker, the quote-unquote collateral damage would be so great that it would bring down the system. Now, Senator Carl Levin, now retired, responded to a question from EIR at a press conference. And we said, well, what do you propose should be done about this evidence of massive financing of drug trafficking and jihadist Salafist terrorism by this bank? He said, well, you know, it's not our job to answer that question. Our job is to do the investigation and turn the material over to the Justice Department. He said, but I'll tell you very frankly, one of the options that we have available is to basically remove that bank's charter. Should have never been allowed to operate in the United States while engaging in all of that criminality. Justice Department and the Obama administration and Wall Street in London saw it very differently. This was one of the crown jewels of the British Empire's financial system, and the facilitating of global drug money laundering, which is indistinguishable from the financing of international terrorism. As we saw in the documentation that the same HSBC was partnered with Saudi banks that were part of the network of financing of al-Qaeda. The policy of the administration was let it go because the system is so fragile that it would basically blow everything up. Well, this system deserves to be blown up, provided that there is a plan underway for an orderly bankruptcy reorganization, which starts here in the United States with the reinstating of Glass-Steagall. Now, we're at a point right now where the war danger, and this is not a danger of local or regional war, this is a danger of world war, which would very likely turn very quickly into a thermonuclear war of extinction, because the target is Russia and China. The motive behind this drive for war is exclusively the bankruptcy of the current London, Wall Street, transatlantic financial system. We've seen in the last several weeks with simply the fact that the Greek government collapsed and new elections will likely bring in a new government in Greece that will rip up the Troika agreement and probably will lead to Greece leaving the Euro system. That alone is being openly talked about as the Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns moment for Europe. In other words, the trigger for a blowout of the entire system. Similarly, in the United States, the mere fact that the Saudis and the British are driving the competition out of business in the oil sector by driving prices down below the appropriate break-even cost of production in most parts of the world is in and of itself creating tremendous ripples within the financial establishment, because the price of oil is the underlying foundation for a mountain of gambling debt, of derivatives contracts, of securitized debt obligations, all kinds of things that amount to the tens of trillions of dollars. So the whole system is extraordinarily fragile. And the only way that that system is going to survive is by either forcing China and Russia to thoroughly capitulate and open themselves up for absolute further looting, or in the alternative, to go to war. Because under the fog of war, many of the financial instruments can be reorganized without having a change in political power. So we have a war danger. What happened in Berlin earlier this week when Yatsenyuk, who remember is Victoria Nuland's our man Yats, his open promotion of support for Nazism, which is something that goes to the core. He's part of a Banderist apparatus from Ukraine, commingling with the right sector, with the Svoboda Party, and that apparatus was aligned with Hitler during the war. And in Berlin, Yatsenyuk was absolutely vivid in his personal assault against Russian President Putin. He accused Putin of sending armies of bandits into eastern Ukraine. He accused Putin, with no evidence whatsoever, of being behind the hacking into government computer databases of the German government. In other words, you have wildly provocative statements coming out by people who are in a situation where their actions can very well be the precipitant for world war, because standing behind that has been the creeping eastward expansion of NATO and other actions, the deployment of the ballistic missile defense system into the southern tier of Europe, the promoting of color revolutions in many areas of the former Soviet Union as well as the Middle East. So because we are on the verge of a major systemic blowout financially, which can only be avoided by a systematic and orderly bankruptcy reorganization, putting Wall Street, putting the City of London out of business altogether. Nothing short of that, which also probably means removing President Obama for his now myriad violations of the U.S. Constitution. unless that course is taken, the danger of war is enormous and is growing by the day. So you have Wall Street, along with the Saudis, along with the British, continuously receiving signals from American governments over the last 14 years that they can act with impunity. And contrast that to what Senator Graham said about the need for a Lincoln-esque presidency, someone who knows that the truth and justice are the two cornerstones of the American constitutional system. I can tell you that in the aftermath of that press conference on Wednesday, there was a tremendous spirit of optimism because people who've been disgusted by the behavior of the overwhelming majority of their elected officials for the last 14 years once again saw a glimmer of hope that there are elected officials that are prepared to fight for the truth and for justice for the American people. They need to have their backs covered. And that's the responsibility of everyone out there, to live up to each and every one of your responsibilities as an informed citizen of this country. It's going to take an enormous fight, but right now, the major enemy of the United States and the major enemy of the world is Wall Street and London, the British Empire system. And it's high time for the United States to become once again the enemy of that oligarchical system and use the real strength of the United States to bring that system down. So that's the larger context, and that's why on an even grander scale it's important to understand that releasing, declassifying these 28 pages is an existential issue for the survival of this country and the world, because we are on the cusp of a major financial blowout, and we are on the cusp of a potential nuclear war. We're in graver danger now than we were at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Jeff, do you want to mention the Hollande factor?
Oh, yeah. There's one other thing I should mention, which is why Paris, why France? If you take in the broad message that we've hopefully presented effectively so far this evening, one thing that should be clear is that the deployment of international terrorism is strategic. And in the case of France right now, why target Hollande? Why target France? In the last several weeks, Hollande, who admittedly is a weak president with very small popular support, has done something very important. He's broken ranks and has pushed back against the pressures from London, from Washington. He's done something that Angela Merkel has yet to do. He's said we must stop these provocations against Russia. We've got to stop pushing on the path for general war. No more sanctions. Roll back the sanctions, and let's try to once again work on a cooperative basis with Russia. That has been a pushback that has infuriated the British and their various allies and cowardly suckers around Europe and the United States. And so there have been comments that I have heard in the last 24 hours from very well-informed people, including in and around the U.S. government, who know what's going on. And they said that basically the attack against the Charlie Hebdo office was actually a warning shot fired at the head of French President Hollande, warning him to back off from his efforts to get in the way of this drive for war.
Thank you very much. Now, we have one final subject matter to take up in our broadcast tonight. As many of our viewers may know, the LaRouche movement is building a major international event, which is upcoming a week from tomorrow, January 17th. This will be occurring centrally in New York City, but it will be, this is part of our so-called Manhattan Project. But there will also be parallel events happening in cities across the country, and this will be broadcast internationally via a live stream that will be hosted on the LaRouche PAC website. It'll also be translated into Spanish, so our international viewers can also participate. Now, this event, which is organized to occur on the weekend of Martin Luther King's birthday, is part of the LaRouche movement's ongoing campaign to return the United States to its original founding principles and to allow it to participate in the proper partnership that it deserves and must play in the new economic order that's being created by the BRICS. The invitation to this event begins with a very powerful quote from Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, which was exactly 1 year to the day before his assassination. The speech was the one where he came out forcefully in opposition to the Vietnam War, and he stated, quote, "We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation," which is precisely where the world stands now and speaks directly to the point that Jeff was just elaborating. Either the United States takes up Xi Jinping's offer to join this win-win cooperation along with the BRICS, or the world will destroy itself through global war. This is also precisely the subject of a petition which is now circulating titled "The U.S. and Europe Must Reject Geopolitics and Collaborate with the BRICS." And as of today, the list of prominent individuals who have signed this petition has now totaled almost 200. The newest signatures include several former members of Congress, including Representative Rodney Alexander from the state of Louisiana and Representative Donna Christensen from the U.S. Virgin Islands. Also includes former Senator Mike Gravel, who represented Alaska in the U.S. Senate from 1969 to 1981, and achieved prominence through his courageous act of putting the Pentagon Papers into the public record. This list also includes former Representative Cornelius Gallagher, who is known to some viewers of our website, also a very courageous man, and former Representative Vance McAllister from Louisiana. Numerous other prominent political leaders, business leaders, academics, scientists, even artists from across the United States, and also from 20 different countries internationally have signed this. Countries in Europe, South and Central America, Asia, far too many to list here. So this list must continue to grow, and it's the responsibility of the viewers of this broadcast to reach out as widely as you can and recruit more people to join this campaign. Now, Mrs. LaRouche also thought it was very significant to emphasize an op-ed that has just been written by a professor in the Pennsylvania area at Lincoln University, Dr. Ganga Ramdas, who teaches economics. And this op-ed is titled, "The U.S. Should Say Yes to the BRICS and No to Wall Street Bailouts." It highlights the Chinese space program, the Nicaragua Canal, the new Suez Canal in Egypt, the high-speed rail projects being financed by China in Africa, and states, quote, "The fact is that the Chinese and other BRICS countries are thinking and acting like America used to act when it functioned as an engine for economic and scientific progress in the world." And the author calls for the United States to return to this tradition, especially the tradition of FDR, to declare war on Wall Street, pass Glass-Steagall, and he concludes by saying, "In the same way that the Founding Fathers showed the wisdom to accept the French support in their fight to liberate themselves from the British Empire in 1778, we should accept the BRICS offer for collaboration in our fight to liberate the nation from the undue influence of Wall Street today. It is time that we, the American people, accept the challenge to restore our tradition of scientific and economic greatness." Now, Mrs. LaRouche emphasized that it's precisely this type of statement that we need to inspire all those who are signing this petition to author and to write and get that voice out there. So to conclude our broadcast, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Beets to give us a brief overview of some of the scientific principles that Mr. LaRouche has been emphasizing over the recent weeks, which must underlie what this new paradigm must be, and how we can think about the scientific principle behind what Xi Jinping has called this win-win system of harmony and mutual development.
So let me just begin with a quote from a speech that Mr. LaRouche gave last month to an audience at the Dubna University in Moscow. He said, speaking about the developments and the increased powers and capabilities housed within the nations of the BRICS system, these nations are moving in a direction of self-development, of joint self-development, which can lead to a new conception of the meaning of the human species and of our planet itself. Things lie before us which have never been dreamed by most people on this planet. But if we are fortunate, we are a few steps in scientific progress toward the greatest leap that mankind has ever defined. And I think that that's the point of all of this. We are certainly not discussing, when we discuss the coming into being of the BRICS system, we're certainly not calling for a reform of the current system. As you've made quite clear tonight, Jeff, the current system is evil. It's the system of Wall Street and empire. And in fact, Mr. LaRouche commented in a discussion earlier today that the British Empire is collapsing and it must collapse. So we're not discussing that, but we're also not discussing returning to some prior, better system which has already existed among mankind. What we have to realize is that today we're presented with an opportunity to remake mankind and the society and organization of mankind to be in coherence with man's true nature, and to put civilization on the pathway of manifesting a rate of progress which has never been known beforehand in the history of man on the planet. Now, in order to do this, we have to come to understand scientifically and to put into practice that which distinguishes man absolutely and fundamentally from the beasts, and to make that conscious practice the dominant characteristic on the planet. Now, in the recent weeks, Mr. LaRouche has highlighted the importance of a series of papers which he authored over the course of 2014, which are entitled Science or Self-Deception. Our USA now enters a new era. The Satan still operating from inside Bertrand Russell's corpse. The 4 new laws to save our USA now. And finally, from Kepler to Gottfried Leibniz. Now, while each of these papers is unique, as a series, they center around defining the absolutely unique species characteristic of mankind as opposed to any other species known to us. And fundamentally, Mr. LaRouche locates that characteristic in the ability of man to search out and discover a quality of true universal principle, which is absolutely beyond and outside of the powers of mere sense perception upon which animals depend. This characteristic has been seen in the greatest discoveries of the greatest minds in history, such as Johannes Kepler in his discovery of the principle of the solar system, which he did not discover by measuring and interpreting the data from sense perception. Quite the contrary. It was only when Kepler was able to compose a unique contradiction among sense perceptions, a contradiction of 2 measurements with which both were true and yet which both could not be true, that Kepler created a crack, a great chasm over which only the mind could leap, and only the mind could hypothesize the experience of the existence of something which was completely unknown before, a leap into the future. This is the quality of discovery which has characterized all of the great contributions to the progress of mankind in both science and in classical art. Now, with this, we find 2 things. First, we find that man, as opposed to all animals which go extinct in time, man is not a fixed species with a fixed species characteristic. Man is able to remake himself and his practice according to higher and higher insights into the organization of nature and to gain a new power over it. For example, we see this in the qualitative leaps upward in power over nature which came with the discovery of nuclear power. man's mastery over the nucleus of the atom. Now, secondly, we see something else. We see that the upward development of the creative powers of the human mind per se does not occur by the work of an individual, as we would tend to define an individual. It occurs as an unbroken thread of a process of progress over centuries, of the contributions of great minds, each augmented by the achievements of the past. The progress of creativity on the planet has fundamentally reorganized this planet into a higher state of organization than would have ever been possible by animal life, the biosphere alone. In fact, if we take a look at the magnitude of the development projects of the BRICS system, the ones already ongoing over the past year and the ones planned for the upcoming months, for example, both the magnitude and the rate of construction of the Nicaragua Canal and the new Suez Canal, we see exactly this taking shape. This unique principle of human life was recognized by a great scientist of the 20th century, Vladimir Vernadsky. Vernadsky spent a lifetime studying the geochemistry of the planet as it was changed and shaped by the action of living matter, the biosphere, shaped into new states, shaped into new concentrations of elements and materials with changing chemical characteristics, all determined by the unified process of upward evolution of the biosphere as a whole, seemingly of separate systems of animals across the planet, across billions of years. However, Vernadsky concluded that it was not animal life, but it was the growth of the scientific thought of man. Even though it has no mass and no special form of energy, the scientific thought of man is the most powerful cause for change on the planet and reshapes it in ways which would have been impossible for animal life to achieve. Vernadsky also recognized that man was not limited to the planet, but was inherently a cosmic species in potential. Now, this principle of man's creative action, which was identified by Vernadsky, but developed much more deeply and fully by the insights of Mr. LaRouche, this is the basis today for the science and the practice of physical economics. This is the basis for Mr. LaRouche's insistence that it is the space program of China today, particularly their commitment to the development of the moon and the resources of the moon, such as helium-3, which is the leading feature of man on the planet today. So I would like to close by reading a short passage from one of Mr. LaRouche's papers, Our USA Now Enters a New Era, which I think beautifully hits home at this principle of man's unique action within the solar system. He says, "It is fair and also necessary to say that the human species makes its own future place voluntarily with respect to all other known living processes, but also absolutely above each and every other living species of living creature presently known to mankind. The fairly accurate description of that distinction is that a human life is governed in its inherently natural design by the necessity of an implicit progress of being a voluntarily upward evolving species of the ontological characteristic of a human life, as distinct from all others presently known to us to exist or have existed. The human species, therefore, always lives, actually, in the progressive development of its own future, to increase continually an ever greater distance in principle from the beasts. This must be manifest in fact, in practice, in a principle of constant anti-entropic change." So I think that that is the point, that man is a species of perpetual progress. And today we have a great responsibility and an opportunity to fulfill the contributions of those who have come before us, but I think especially to fulfill the potential of the great achievements which lie ahead. And it's critical today that we dedicate ourselves to winning the fight against the system of empire, to liberate mankind to be truly human, to manifest the natural system of mankind, and to be able to constantly come to a higher and higher understanding of what mankind is and what mankind should and could be in the solar system.
Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you very much, Jeff. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in tonight. I'm going to bring a conclusion to our webcast here. We obviously have a very large responsibility, but I think we are fully equipped to carry out the task that is asked of us. So please do everything that you can, circulate this press conference as widely as possible, and stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com. Good night.